Minister, I think we've all noticed over the last year or two a major number of planning applications for solar power arrays coming forward, particularly in a number of counties like Wicklow, Limerick, and my own county in Fingal. Just asking you, like, where do you see, what's the current level of proposed solar array power generation? How do you see that fitting into the renewable strategy? And secondly, you announced those grants for the households for solar microgeneration for the PV grants on the roofs and so on, I think a couple of months ago. And again, what's your targets in that area? Why are you so loath to allow the microgenerators, which are all of us, to, if you like, access the grid? Thanks, Cathal.
I'll read the reply and I'll try and come back to your questions then, Deputy Broughan. The 2016 programme for government and the 2015 Energy White Paper recognise that solar photovoltaic or solar PV has the potential to provide a community dividend, thereby enhancing citizen participation in Ireland's energy future, and solar PV has the potential to contribute to meeting Ireland's renewable energy and climate change objectives. While the Energy White Paper identifies the long-term strategic importance of diversifying Ireland's energy generation portfolio and largely decarbonising the sector by 2050, it does not set out targets for specific renewable technologies, but rather it provides a framework to guide policy between now and 2030. My department is currently developing a new renewable electricity support scheme to assist Ireland in meeting its renewable energy contributions to EU-wide targets by 2030. The design of the new scheme has included an extensive economic appraisal which compared the cost of supporting solar PV, both rooftop and ground-mounted, and a range of other commercial renewable technologies at various scales to ensure that the new scheme delivers value for money for energy users, whilst also delivering on the energy pillars of sustainability and security of supply. The analysis indicates that a number of renewable technologies, including solar PV, have converging and in some cases overlapping cost ranges, and it is widely recognised that solar PV technology has become more cost competitive for electricity generation over the last few years, not only compared with other renewables, but also compared with conventional forms of generation. I'm keen to see the new scheme encouraging the diversification of renewable energy technologies in Ireland, while mindful of the need to minimise the cost on consumers through the public service obligation. I'm well aware of the very strong level of interest in solar PV in Ireland due to its potential role in Ireland's future energy mix, and I've written to Minister Murphy highlighting my view that the planning guidelines will need to be developed. In this regard, my officials in the department are engaging. The officials in my department, the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, are engaging. In January this year, I announced a proposed pilot scheme for microgeneration that will target solar PV and self-consumption among domestic consumers, which is due to commence this summer. Further details of the scheme will be made available when I have received a study being undertaken by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland into the likely uptake and demand for the scheme and have an opportunity to consider its analysis.
Thanks, Minister. Okay, Deputy Broughan.
Obviously, I welcome the comments you're making there in relation to planning. Obviously, you know, when you say about targets and specific targets, I mean, surely, though, you should be aiming at something particularly for the 2030 deadline for 2050. I mean, I noticed the UK has 8.4 gigawatts of solar capacity. Germany is something like 35. I think the Irish Solar Energy Association, the chief executive, who is a former member, I think, of this House, Michael McCarthy, said that the potential here is something like 3.7 gigawatts. But the whole issue, as you say, I think, is related to cost and you know, how that will impact ultimately on consumers. And so, is there a consideration, or is there an evaluation cost-benefit of specific solar subsidy for the public service obligation? Is that something that you're looking at? And then, secondly, just in relation to that solar arrays, in relation to microgeneration, I think there was disappointment that you know, you didn't bring forward supports as well for the SME sector, for small businesses, and in particular, obviously, for farms, and you know, so that we get much wider microgeneration around the country. And you also seem to be, and there seems to be a great reluctance to allow microgeneration to feed into the national grid.
Thanks,
you said, in fact, it's hard to manage, but surely that's a task of ESB networks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cathal.
First of all, there are some supports through the SEAI for SMEs at the moment, and it would be my intention, once we get the microgeneration off the ground, to see that expanded again to the SME sector. There are particular technical challenges in relation to microgen, and that's based on experience across Europe, where a significant amount of investment has to be put into strengthening the grid in terms of microgen output onto the grid. And the trend now is, with electric cars and so forth, is for self-consumption. And I think we can provide a cheaper, more effective solution to homeowners through microgen, through self-consumption, and that's why we want to pilot this initially and see can we work in relation to that. On the solar arrays, there are 658 solar applications to connect to the grid at present, which would bring 6,533 megawatts onto the grid. The current winter peak demand in this country is for 5,500 megawatts. So there is a significant oversubscription than would meet our existing demand, never mind future demand.
Deputy?
Minister, yeah, I mean it's an extraordinary figure, actually, the amount of proposals that have come forward. So, I mean, it is clearly welcome that on the planning front that you know, yourself and Minister Murphy will be working closely together, because the thing that struck us all, I suppose, about looking at some of the applications is that I think to get a 1 megawatt, you need to have like a GAA pitch plus maybe a rugby or a soccer pitch beside it, covered in the array for just a single megawatt, and 25 whatever it is acres for 5 megawatts. So there is a huge land use issue, and then all the other uses which have come up in various planning issues in relation to obviously the impact on the landscape, electromagnetic fields, the inverter and transformer, the noise of some of the systems that have to be used. So I think that is welcome and something that needs to be kept under observation. Just in relation to the base load going forward, particularly 2030 targets, I mean, do you see not just microgeneration, but obviously solar arrays playing a very a fundamental role in giving us a more sustainable base load as we move forward?
Thanks, Deputy. Minister to respond.
Yes, both solar, microgen, rooftop, SME and ground-mounted will form part of the energy mix over the next decade. But to be quite honest with you, I suspect the heavy lifting is actually going to come on the offshore area. I think the potential we have in this country, particularly off the coast of Deputy Dooley's constituency, is significant. And I think we really, as a country, need to develop that resource. We're at the cutting edge in relation to the research in that area. Now I think we need to be at the cutting edge in relation to the deployment. And I think we have a lot of the basic fundamental building blocks there, but we need to build on that. And I think, you know, in the first half of the next decade, I think solar will play a far greater role than in the second half of the next decade, where I think offshore renewables will play a key role.
Thank you, Minister.